I have a story about how one's kindness can come back to them, in that the fruits of their kindness turn to the good, that because they did this, the kindness was returned to them. So several years ago, I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it was a cold, wintry night. And it was a Friday night, and I had a Suda with the Rav of Michigan. We call him the Michiganer Rav. And because it was in January, it was the Shabbat ended, the meal ended early. And it was time for me to go to my, where I was staying. It was on the campus of the University of Michigan, at the University of Michigan. And I'm not one to go to bed early. So so I sat in the lobby to read because there was lights there. And in walked a man with a kippah and a beard and the peyot and the long black coat. And he sat next to me, and I thought, oh, I'm going to get a good story, because all of these guys have stories, and who doesn't love a good story? And he said to me, he introduced himself, he said, would you like to hear a story? I thought, well, yeah. So he said the following. He said, back in the 1930s, it was depressions. There was a depression in the United States. There was a lot of people out of work, and there was not as much food available. People were unemployed. It wasn't a good time. And there was this gentleman that lost his job. He had been a master plumber, and things weren't good for him. And he was a fromme yid, a religious man, and he would go to shul for Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, and he'd learn in the shul during the day. And he'd go home to his hovel, and that was his life at that time. And on Shabbat, women would go to shul. And there was this one woman that would observe his davening, and she saw such an aura coming from him. There was such kavanah, such intent, and he was so into speaking with Hashem. She could feel it, and she wanted to know who he was. So she kind of went to the gabbai of the shul and asked who this man was. And the gabbai said, well, it's there's a gentleman, he lost his job. She could tell he was very poor because of his dress. And he said, and he doesn't have a job. He was a plumber. And that's what she found out about him. But that she kept thinking about him. She went home, and she thought there's something she wants to do for him, but she doesn't know what. But because he's a plumber, she's going to devise a way to use his services. So she asked the gabbai where he lived, and the gabbai didn't know. So she decided in the dark of night that when after Ma'ariv, she would follow him to see where he lived. So she found out where he lived, and she asked the gabbai, would you go to this person's house and tell him I have a stuffed up toilet? She stuffed toilet paper in it and all kinds of things. And she devised a way to get the plumber to come to her house. So he came to the house, he fixed the toilet, and she paid him. She tried to give him extra. He wouldn't take it, and he thanked her and he left. Then she's feeling badly because the money she gave him isn't going to go very far. So she stuffed toilet paper back in, and whatever it is, she put in the toilet again, and she had him come back. And she said, well, the kids, I have kids come over and they stuffed it. I can't help it. So he fixed it, but he realized this was some kind of a ruse for her to give him money. So he very politely said, please don't do this again. I know what you're doing. I don't need your help. I don't want your help. I have everything I need from Hashem. I appreciate it very much. And he leaves. So she doesn't know what to do. The man needs help. So she said to the Rabbi, I know where this man lives. So would you, I want you to come every Erev Shabbat and pick up a package for me and deliver it to him. It would have food in there and stuff for Shabbat. So the Rabbi agreed, and he would take it, and every Friday this plumber would receive Shabbat stuff. And the plumber couldn't figure out who was leaving it. He didn't know why this was happening. So, of course, the Rabbi did it in such a way that he wouldn't be seen. But the plumber was determined to find out who is this that's leaving this package for me. So he is diligent in waiting for whoever's going to deliver the package, and he sees that it's the Rabbi. So he says to the Rabbi, why are you doing this? So the Rabbi said, well, Mrs. Her name is Yentl Libowitz, told me to do this for you. And he says, that's the woman that had me fix her toilet. And he says, I don't want this anymore. So the plumber goes to Mrs. Libowitz, and he says to her, I appreciate what you're doing. I don't want you to do this anymore. I'm fine. I don't like accepting gifts. It just rubs me the wrong way. I want you to stop it. And she said, okay, on condition that you take this card. There is I have an acquaintance who owns buildings, and he needs somebody to oversee the maintenance in the building. You call him, and I'm going to find out whether you did or didn't. And if you didn't, you're going to continue getting these packages. Otherwise, I'll leave you alone. So he says, where's the phone? So so she lets him use her telephone, and he calls this a Mr. Katz, and he makes an appointment to see him. So he goes to Mr. Katz's office. It's a very luxurious office. And Mr. Katz talks to the plumber, and he says, I have a building that's empty, and it's in disrepair. I want it more or less gutted. It's 5 stories, and it needs to be refurbished. And I need a master plumber to oversee that the blueprints for the plumbing is going to be done well, and I understand you're the man for the job. And he said, I know you're poor, I know your circumstances, so I'm going to give you an apartment in the building on the first floor, and plus you'll get a salary. So the plumber said, I appreciate what you're doing, and I will accept the job on the condition that the whole first floor of the building is for the use of people such as myself that have nowhere to go and that they need a place to stay. If you donate the first floor of this building to people in need, I will do the job. So he was taking a chance, but Mr. Katz said, okay. So it takes a year for the building to be finished, and it was time for people to move in, and the job was finished. And Mr. Katz called the plumber, and he said, you did a great job. I have 5 more buildings just like it. I want you to oversee it. So yada, yada, fast forward, the plumber becomes wealthy. And I skipped the main part. The story begins. It's in Brooklyn, New York, and this the Skulener Rav lived in Brooklyn in Crown Heights. And he was known to be one that would be benevolent to children, and he adopted a lot of children. And his name was Eliezer Zusha, Portugal, but he was known as the Skulener Rav. And people would come to him for advice. So, the day was finished with seeing people, but up pulled a car, a limousine. And out of the limousine comes this man, and he goes to the shamash of the Skulener Rav. And he says, I want to see the Skulener Rav. Here's $5,000. Give it to the Rav. And he can do whatever he wants with it. So the shamash goes to the Skulener Rav, and he says, there's a man that wants to see you. We know it's late, but he says, here's $5,000. You can do whatever you want with it. Just see him. So the Skulener Rav said, show him in. So this man sits down and starts to tell him, he says, I know you're a widower, and you should not be alone. And I have this wonderful woman that I'm positive will be suited for you. So I just want you to meet her. I want you to take this $5,000, do whatever you want to help with whatever. Just meet her. So the Skulener Rav says, why? So this man tells the story about the plumber and how he became wealthy, and about this Mrs. Leibowitz. And the Skulener Rav says, after the plumber tells the story, he says, well, what makes you think she's good for me? He says, because I'm the plumber. And I know this woman. And so the Skulener Rav meets the woman, and he marries her. And she was also a widow. And so, they're married. His shul is connected to his house. So every Friday night, before he would enter the shul, there was something askew with him. He was never together. And she'd always say, oh, straighten your tie. So, he'd straighten his tie, and he'd say, are you happy now? And then she'd say, yeah, and he'd go into shul. So a few years later, she passed away. But before he would go into shul every Friday night, he'd stand in the mirror, and he'd straighten his tie, and he'd look up, he'd say, are you happy now? Well, that's basically the story. So the gentleman that was telling me the story, I said, how do you know this story? And he said, well, I spent a lot of time at the Skulener Rav's house as a child growing up, because Mrs. Leibowitz is my grandmother.